welcome to Music City listeners. I'm your host, Dewey Boyd, and I wanted to know how people find their place in the music industry. So I've started asking the best listeners I can find how they did it, or maybe how it happened to them. Join me, won't you? We'll start with a simple, where are you from? And we'll see where this all goes. Tonight's guest, which I'm assuming you've probably done a little bit of digging since you're here, is Cason Cooley, and here he is. Now you know what he looks like. Yes. If you've been here before, then you know that this is what happens. So, Cason, where are you from?
Well, I guess Nashville now. I've lived here for 20 years. But I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, and spent, the first 18 years of my life there. I actually was born in Akron, Ohio, because my dad played piano in a Southern Gospel Quartet there, toured with them the 5 years prior to me being born, and then they moved to Kansas to be closer to family.
Which group was that?
He played for a Southern Gospel Quartet called the Cathedral Quartet.
I don't know if I ever told you this, but I think one of the first times I met you, you were coming into Shane Wilson's place, and your dad was with you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because the great Cason Cooley had come to visit, and Shane was a consummate professional while you were there. When you left, he was as giddy as a schoolgirl.
That's funny.
Because he had apparently grown up listening to them and knew who your dad was and was raving about it. I was like, I don't know anything about this world.
No, it's a whole other world.
Yeah. That's amazing. So was that somewhat your introduction to music, growing up in a musical?
100%. Like, I was thinking about that the other day. I don't have memories of not doing music. Like, I was singing with my parents on stage. I'm not a singer now. Like, I'm not an artist. But when I was a kid, I sang on stage with my parents from when I was 2 years old until probably about 16 is when I kind of stayed home and started going to school. So harmonizing with them, just hearing music in that way was always a part of, it was just ingrained in me from a very early age. Was around the piano all the time, but I didn't have, my mom tried to give me lessons, and I just didn't have the patience for it. I didn't want to learn the technical side of it, and it's been, I don't know, it's been a problem ever since. I wish I would have learned it, because I would love to do things like arrange strings and write things out, but I don't read music. I can, but just very slow. Anyway, but I was around a piano all the time and listened to music that I liked and was picking things out on the piano. So I kind of learned to play by ear. My dad had made he had a book. They had their table with their cassettes and stuff that they would sell at their shows, and he had this book called Chords and Chord Symbols, and it was just, all the chords, all the piano chords. So I would learn to make them because it would lay it out on how you would play it on the piano. So I knew chords, but I just couldn't read like on a staff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's a very different thing.
So I was always around music, but it was this very specific genre for a long time until I found other music.
So walk me through how that happened, because I didn't realize that you were like singing and things at like 2 years old. So how?
No, I was singing when I was 2, but I played nothing musical, percussion stuff with my parents as well. But
so both of your parents play piano?
So they both play piano, but my mom actually plays bass. So that's sort of the format of. So my dad quits the quartet when I'm born.
Okay.
Starts traveling around with my mom. She plays bass and sings harmony, and then when I'm 2, I kind of start singing harmony with them, and so that was sort of.
So it was like a.
So I grew up on the road, traveling with them, singing music, doing music, and they still do it. Like, my dad's going to be 79 coming up, and they still travel and do music.
What's the name of that group? Is it just their name?
The Coolies.
The Coolies.
Yeah. So that's kind of what they do. But so I did that, and eventually started discovering other music eventually, and collected CDs, and I would, save up money and go to the pawn shop. I get $20 at a time and just go to all the pawn shops in Wichita and just buy CDs that I was into. And that's how I would discover music. And so just, putting on headphones, listening to music. I loved that. And then, but I had this part of me where I wanted to get out of music. I thought I've done that my whole life. I kind of wanted to have another profession. Kind of wanted to be an architect. Thought I was going to go to school for architecture. And I don't know, my personality type, if you study Enneagram stuff, a lot of my friends study that. Like I would be a 7, which is the enthusiast, and your biggest fear is missing out on things. So I think I had that sense of, I had done this, I wanted to do something else. I also really loved basketball. I played basketball in high school, and I thought I wanted to get like a small scholarship somewhere and continue to play in college. And then I had a bad knee injury junior year, ACL tear. And then had surgery on that, and then tore my other ACL the next year. So just 2 kind of bad turns of bad luck. Yeah. But that gave me a lot of time in my bedroom, on crutches, just listening to records. I had an acoustic guitar, so I was learning to play that. And it just hit me one day that I was listening to a record, and I was like, oh, the shaker came in here, and this came in here, and this wasn't just people playing live in a room. Like there was an arrangement to this, and there was layers, and there must have been a team of people that were making these decisions. And I just thought, I want to be one of those people that make those decisions. Like I just wanted to be in the room.
How old were you when you like had that?
That was probably like 16 or 17.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I never really got into it to be a performer. And I'm not. Like I played a lot of different instruments, but I don't have one instrument that that I'm tied up in. Sure. I don't need to be known for playing any particular thing. I just always loved listening to records and wanted to be a part of making them. Just having something out there that I would want to hear, maybe other people would too, because I grew up loving records so much. But that was sort of the incubation time when I was listening to records and just fell in love with that as a craft and as an art form.
Okay. So then coming out of high school then, where did you go from Wichita?
So I knew I wanted to study music. All the schools that I was looking at in Kansas, like the music, like the department where they had recording departments, were just they just didn't have much to offer. And I had this sense that, New York and LA were the places to go, but just for a kid from Kansas, that felt too big. Like it was too big of a leap. And someone had told me about Belmont. Nashville seemed like a doable town. So I applied, got in, and I never visited. I just drove. I packed my car and drove and showed up for school.
Oh, wow.
And as I've grown, the city's grown. So I think there was this times along the way where I really wanted to I really wanted to live in New York. I still kind of do. A lot of the music that I was loving was coming out of LA. I didn't really want to live in LA. I feel like I could now because I know people there and I really enjoy it there. But I feel so rooted here. Like I would go visit New York and I'd meet people and they'd be like, "You have a house and this much of a yard and a studio in back, and you're paying like a third of what I'm paying for my apartment, and I have to have a studio on top of that." Yeah. So I felt rooted down. It felt affordable. It felt like a nurturing community. It was inspiring. People were doing stuff, and I've been here 20 years and I've been busy. So I could have done it somewhere else, but I did it here. And there's never a shortage of stuff to do here. So
yeah,
and more people moving here all the time.
Like crazy.
Yeah. So it's just there was never any need.
Yeah. So I know that there's kind of a whole crew of people who went through Belmont at the same time, that some other people that I know in music that you were a part of. Yeah. What sort of projects did you start getting in and around?
Okay, so yeah. I went to Belmont to study engineering because that was my big plan. Was like I wanted to get in the studio. I wanted to produce, but I figured you don't just take a class for that. Like it's so psychological. You're just kind of emotionally babysitting people through a season where they're vulnerable and putting themselves out there. So you don't really learn that in the classroom. But I thought if I could learn engineering, that'll be a skill that I could use, and that'll get me in the studio where I can kind of glean and sponge information. And so that was my big plan. But I couldn't get into the studios at Belmont until I had X number of credits.
Right.
And I had an opportunity to intern at some studios, but I couldn't get credit for the internships because I didn't have enough credits. And so I felt like I was kind of spinning my wheels there, and it was expensive. So I had kind of made up my mind that I was going to drop out of there and just go to like a state school and just kind of get all my prereqs done for cheaper, or just go to like a tech school, like just to learn engineering. But, I met friends that were doing music and just started doing music.
Yeah.
But the significant one was I'd met Andy Osenga, who was a freshman. He was an English major.
He was?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
He'd come to town because he'd been offered, it wasn't even like a traditional publishing deal, but a producer had brought him down to write, and they were making demos. And that was kind of in the days where, I guess people still do it, but he was developing him to try to sell it off to a label, which happened. Forefront Records had signed Andy and his band, which at the time was called Mezzanine Circle. And they got signed. And so they ended up going on the road, changed their name to the Normals.
Where does that name come from?
Normal, Illinois is the town that they're from in Illinois.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Of course.
So they're from Normal, Illinois. And they asked me to go out on the road to road manage for them. Like we were pals in college, so I thought, this is great. Like I grew up on the road with my parents, loved traveling, but I always had that sense of like, this would be really fun with a group of guys, not just doing it with my parents.
Yeah.
So that was sort of an opportunity to do that. And so I went out on the road with them, road managing, did that for about a year. And then when they went to make their second record, they were starting to want to add a keyboard player. I was like, hey, I can kind of play. And so as an excuse just to hang out while they made the record, they made the second record. Is there any questions about that? I feel like I'm talking really fast.
Oh,
is there?
no.
I mean, like at the time, I'm like, it's so long ago now that people know what Forefront Records is. Like that was.
Do people know what Forefront Records is? The nods.
I mean, coming out of high school.
Do people know what the Normals is?
That felt like a really big
find
deal.
It on Spotify.
Coming out of high school, like Forefront Records had like all these big Christian artists that I had known so well, like DC Talk and Rebecca St. James and Audio Adrenaline and all these big bands. Mm-hmm. So for them to get signed to this label and that I would get to go road manage for them as a an 18-year-old kid that just moved here from Kansas felt like a really big opportunity. Yeah. So, and I felt like I could drop out of college and just
so this was still freshman year?
It felt like freelancing.
Okay.
It was freshman year that I met them, and they started doing shows, so I was starting to travel with them, and my grades started to tank.
Naturally, as they would.
But then, as that was picking up, I was like, I feel like I'm in the industry. Like I'm doing something in the industry. I'm around music being made. I'm getting to hang out in studios. Like I feel like I'm getting a foot in the door.
Yeah.
And so it felt like the right move to make at the time. So I didn't go back to school sophomore year and just started touring with them. And not really thinking that I wanted to play in the band originally, but they were wanting to add a keyboard player. I could play. It was an excuse to hang out with them. And when they were going to make their second record, we had chased down this producer, Malcolm Byrne, who we knew because he did a Better Than Ezra record that we loved, but more specifically he had engineered and mixed Wrecking Ball, which was this Emmylou Harris record that Daniel Lanois produced that we were over the moon about, and that was the world for us. Like anything Lanois was doing, U2, Peter Gabriel stuff, like that was the world we wanted to be close to. So we chased this guy down, and he'd agreed to do the record, and he just had a house in New Orleans, like a big house, like this. Like you're recording in a house, like that was sort of unheard of at the time. Yeah. For us, it was to be out of a studio and be in a cozy home. So I packed a bunch of keyboards, went down there. We all tracked live. I just thought everyone else will play stuff. I'll be around. I can replicate it live, but I don't need to play on the record. But we all tracked as a band, so I ended up playing a lot on the record. And so that just sort of got me in a situation where, hey, I'm here at this guy's house playing keyboards on a record for a label. It felt like, a real thing.
Yeah, it sounds like a real thing.
Yeah. So that was really shaping. I've said we ended up making 2 records with Malcolm, and that's what really made me fall in love with making records. The way he did it, the way a group of people could kind of just be together. I loved being in a band, and I loved the way those records happened. Looking back on it, I think I learned a lot in terms of how to interact with people, how the pace of a day goes. One thing that sticks out to me specifically was I was playing a keyboard part on this song that just was a boring part because it was easy to play. You know, I always wanted to sit down and blow my own mind with something I would come up with. And I was just thinking, like, man, like I just can't come up with anything. This is lame. This is an elementary part. And, you know, the bass player ran in from the other room and was like, dude, that's awesome. Like, that's so cool. That's got to go in that verse. Yeah. And removed from that situation, I did like the part. Like, it was boring to play, but it wasn't boring to listen to. Right. You know, and I feel like that was an early learning experience, too, that the experience of playing a part is entirely different from the experience of listening to a part. And so to have a group of people around that can jump in from the other room and be like, that's awesome, don't stop doing that, is so valuable to the creative flow. So I fell in love with records and a team of people working together during that time. But I didn't glean anything technically because I just didn't know anything. I didn't know what to pay attention to. I mean, I paid attention to some stuff, but I feel like if I would have had that experience 10 years later, I would have learned so much more. Yeah. But so that was sort of like the first real record making experience that I had.
Which I didn't think to ask this, but did your parents make records along the way that you were a part of?
They did.
I imagine it was a pretty different experience.
Yeah, my dad had an ADAT, 8 tracks, and he plays piano.
I'm close enough to that world to have a general idea of how it went, but go on.
No, he would just play piano.
Yeah.
And my parents would sing their harmonies, and my dad would just manually go through and just hand drum parts into the song. So it was, that was sort of the setup at the house.
Yeah.
So like being in a house and making more modern music, and that was a totally different thing. Nice. I felt like.
So so Normal's 2 records in. Where do we go from here?
Yeah. So.
Or maybe like where are we like chronologically year wise, like just to kind of put a stake in the ground.
Well, I remember watching the 1999 Super Bowl while we were making that first record where the Titans lost. So I always it's always like a milestone in my head. So the band broke up in 2002 after the second record was done, and I feel like there was the mistake that I feel like maybe I made. Like, I meet a lot of people now that are like 20, 19, and they're like focused on what they're doing, and they're like getting technical about and maybe they just have the tools more available to them. I felt like the tools weren't available to me, so I didn't know how to learn if I wasn't in a situation to learn. But now I feel like everyone can dive in, and I see younger people that are they're more technical, they're learning things quicker. And I was friends with Paul, during that time, and he was always like practicing in his basement.
Which is Paul Moak for everyone listening at home.
Yeah, he was a buddy of mine from college, and we actually never went to college together, but we were friends during that time. But I feel like maybe I had a sense of like, since I was in a band and I was in these situations, that that would just continue on for a while.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there was a lot of time that I could have been digging in and learning more when I wasn't. Like I didn't really cross a bridge in my mind to say like, I want to make records, I'm going to dig in, I can do this, until really like maybe 3 or 4 years after that.
Okay.
So the band had broken up, and then I went through another season of like, maybe I don't want to do music anymore. Like maybe I wanted to go back to school, maybe get a history degree. I thought maybe I would teach history. I didn't know, but I had been dating a girl for a few years from Kansas, and so it was long distance, on again, off again for a while. The band had broken up. I kind of wanted to get out of town and just sort of clear my head. So I thought I'll go back to Kansas. I'll see this relationship through and see if it's something that needs to happen, and I'll take history classes at Wichita State. And so I was doing that, and so that was, it seemed, in that season of life, like 6 months feels like 3 years.
Oh, yeah.
So it was just a 6 or 8 month period, but while I was there, I just thought, I can do music. Like, I have a knack for it. I enjoy it. I know people. I feel like I have a personality that suits it. I've met so many people on the road that had jobs that paid really well. that would be like, man, if I could trade places with you, I would do it. Like, what a dream to travel around and do music and be in the studio doing stuff. Just what a dream job that is. I'm like, you know what? It's my dream job too. And it's available to me. Maybe it's because I was around it from such a young age. I thought maybe I wanted to do something else. But yeah, I went through that thing. A good example of this is what I was listening to something with Dave Chappelle the other day, talking about how he wanted to get into comedy, and his dad was like, you know, you're gonna chase your dreams, and you know it's an illusion, and you know not everyone achieves their dreams. And he's like, yeah, but you're a school teacher. He's like, what salary do you make? You know, he said whatever it was. He's like, I figure if I can make that much doing comedy, then I'd rather do comedy than teach school. So it was a very blue collar approach at that point, where I was like, if I can do this and make money, it's something that I like to do. I'd rather do that than whatever temp work I was doing in Wichita at the time.
Yeah.
So I moved back to town. Andy Osinga had just used the advance from the last record to buy a Digio 1 rig.
Yes.
Which was the kind of first iteration of Pro Tools, and I was wanting to get in, just to make records more.
Yeah.
And now we had something in our house that we could work with, and we roomed together. So we had a setup there at the apartment, and we made his first solo record together, which was the first kind of foray into making a record without. We weren't sitting under another producer. Right. It was just us doing it. We would have friends come over and play with it, and it was just fun.
Yeah.
And I just thought, man, I just want to keep getting better at this. Yeah. It's like that thing of like, if I can get like a little better at this every day and just do that for years, I think this feels like kind of like living the dream.
Yeah. I didn't know that you guys lived together and did that record. That's amazing.
Yeah, we did. Will Sales drummed on it. Paul Moak played on it some.
Of course.
Like that was sort of the crew back in those days.
Yeah.
We were all kind of the same age together. Trying to think of like where this is in the timeline now. I was just freelancing for a lot of friends, like going on the road playing with people. I still toured a lot, as much as I could, because that paid, and just making indie records for friends there was no money really in that at the time. But I'm trying to think of the timeline of all this. Another kind of significant moment in all this is I had been playing with Derek Webb. Like he was in a band called Caven's Call, and he had left the band to start a solo record, and I'd played on the road with him some, but he made this record called I See Things Upside Down that I wasn't asked to produce. Like the way we did that record was he wrote all the songs, recorded them all on acoustic guitar with a click track at his house, then kind of assembled this team, which was me, Paul Moak, Will Sales, Matt Pearson, Justin Laux was engineering, and we did it at the old Smokestack.
Okay.
Next to Pentaveret.
Yeah.
And so we were all kind of producing together, but it ended up being me and Derek spent a lot of time after that initial tracking was done. So it was the first record that I felt like I was producing, where I was kind of a little bit more in that role. And but this is the story I was going to tell you is, so the old Smokestack, for anyone of you that would even remember that or know Paul Moak or Will Sales, when they were both single, they lived in the back of the studio, just a little ranch house. There was 2 bedrooms, and Paul was on tour maybe, and we were doing the record there, and Derek was out of town, so there was these 2 days where Will and I were just working on it by ourselves, doing drum overdubs, percussion overdubs, and I just crashed there. I was like, well, I'll just sleep in Paul's bed while he's gone, and we'll just work on this record 24/7,
Yeah.
And we had gone to lunch, and we were like, hey, we wanted to build this real kind of swampy percussion loop for this song, and we're like, should we after lunch go back and do that, or do you want to go see a movie? And there's some movie we really wanted to go see. We're like, well, let's go see that movie. And I was like, this is the best job ever. Like, in the middle of the day, you can decide to just go see a movie or make a percussion loop. It just felt so like on your own. You were on your own time. So I don't know. I just felt like if I can get good at this and do this, I'm gonna try.
Yeah.
And so there was that record, and then the next record is the one where he kind of formally asked me to produce it with him. Like we co-produced it together, and Shane engineered and mixed that one.
Which one was that?
That was called Mockingbird.
That was Mockingbird. Okay.
But that felt like the first time that I was like formally asked to do something by someone who was established. It felt that was definitely a marker for me. I think that was around 2004.
I still listen to that record, by the way. It's a great record.
No, I'm still really happy with how all that turned out. But that was a very formative experience. And so I'm trying to think, like we did that. Oh, and I just started dating my now wife at the time. And I remember thinking, I'm gonna need a real job. You know, I'm gonna have to treat this like a real job.
Right. Yeah.
And I felt like maybe I had a lot of friends that did music professionally, and because it does seem like so much of like a boyhood dream, they maybe didn't take it as seriously as they should have. Like, oh, maybe I'll just, I'll take these extra days off to do these extra things because this is. I feel like sometimes maybe musicians can treat what they do as a little silly or a little fun. They don't quite treat it with the respect it deserves. So I thought if this is something that's going to continue on for me in the future, when I have a family and continue to do this, I need to treat it like a real job. Like I need to put in. I mean, for the first several years, I was putting in 15 to 18 hours a day. But I feel like I've been able to scale it back to like 8 or 10, because my wife and I have 3 kids now, so I don't want to spend every waking hour in the studio like I used to. But I did put in those years initially. I feel like it was one of the point I was going to make about that. Oh yeah, I just had this sense of I didn't want to have a plan B, but I also didn't want to make my family suffer if it wasn't working out. Like I was going to continue to follow this dream at all costs.
Yeah.
But I just thought, I'm going to give it 10 years. And if I can get a little bit better than the day before, at the end of 10 years, I should know whether this is a viable thing for me. And so that was like right around that 2004 period was like, I'm all in. I'm taking it seriously. I'm going to figure out what making.
Was that the beginning of the 10-year? Your 10-year window?
That was the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I meant you like in the middle of the 10-year window.
Yeah, I'm past
it
now.
That's good. You're really committed at this point.
Yeah.
You're a lifer now.
I'm all in. Yeah, I don't know what else I would do now.
Yeah. That's funny. It's kind of a common story like that we've heard from like Russ Long, who's a really great engineer, is here. And the last time that we did this, and he, it was kind of like, well, I'm still getting away with doing this, so I'm just gonna.
Yeah, there's that sense of like, well,
at some point you just kind of you hit the tipping point. You're like, yeah, we're gonna keep doing this.
No, it's been however many years of this now. Even at that point though, I wasn't like I didn't have a full year of producing records. I was getting asked to do some stuff.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I had a good live gig in the middle of that, which was really important. And if you're starting out wanting to get into production, it was great for me to have. I was friends with Will Sales. He was just started to drum for Matt Carney, who was just starting to come up.
Yeah.
And I had played on the road with a couple different people. I played at church some, but Will was like, "Dude, you got to buy bass. You got to come audition for this gig." Like,
Is that when you picked up bass?
And he told Matt, he's like, "Cason's like the sickest bass player in town. You got to give this guy a chance."
Would totally do that.
No, we've laughed about this story since then. But I was friends with Tony Lucido, who played on the record, so he kind of showed some stuff to me.
Tony, can you show me how to play real quick?
Yeah. Jeff Irwin was like playing right before that, and I had friends that were kind of involved with the gig, and they needed to move on to other things. So, yeah, I did not the rehearsal, but an audition, and they're like, "Oh, that sounds great,"
Yeah.
So I had that gig for 3, and then
I didn't know that you were
like,
the road bass player for.
Yeah. Well, when I started, it was like van and trailer, like the weekly pay was very low, and then like right after that, he got a new publicist, and it was like 2 weeks where like Conan started playing Conan and let him all the TV shows happen. The single did really well, so. It was a good. I played with him for 3 years. We're still really close friends.
Yeah.
We work in the studio some. Like that's been an enduring friendship and relationship of mine. But it was important for me to have that gig because we would be off the road, and I had very low overhead, so I was making enough on the road that when I got home, I could just invest. I could build a portfolio. Like I could. So I had a few records that I thought I'm going to go all in on these records and really. Show what I feel like I can do. Like this is the best I can. Money's not an issue. Ideally it should never be an issue, but these are just those things where I was like, I'll put in however many hours it takes to make these records as good as possible, just to kind of have a portfolio of what I feel like I can do or would want to do.
Any of those records that you'd want to say off the top of your head?
Yeah, there were 3 in particular, and they were kind of they were all friends of mine. So, but they were kind of all 3 intentionally different. Mm-hmm. And the first one was Katie Herzig. That's been another like enduring relationship of mine. We were working today right before I came over. We've done 3 full-length records now, and who knows how many like one-offs for different things, and co-produced for other artists. But I tend to be, I think, a little shy. Like I'm not super forward with talking to people. I didn't want to be a schmoozy guy when I moved to town. Yeah. And I had a couple friends that weren't schmoozy people. They were just honest people. They'd walk up to people and be like, "Hey man, like I love what you do. Like we should work together sometime." And it was like, I was like, that's the most sincere, honest thing ever. So I was like, I have those feelings. I should say those feelings to people. Yeah. So it makes people's day. They can tell if you're, shooting them straight or not. So I'd seen Katie play. I'd heard Matt Carney had played me one of her records. Like, you gotta hear this girl. She's awesome. Yeah. And so I guess maybe we probably met a couple times, but I saw her at a show and I was like, hey, I think what you do is awesome and I would love to work with you. And I knew she produced her own stuff, but she's like, yeah, I've been wanting to work with another producer and kind of expand what I do. So yeah, we should do something. So she came over and we did a couple songs, and she had a record that ended up on a record called Weightless, and I did about half that record. It's like 4 or 5 songs, and then so we worked together. At this point? At that point, in 2004 as well, I bought a house in East Nashville. Uh-huh. If you can imagine, 2004, like right down from Mos Taco.
Yeah.
Like,
oh, I know the place.
Only place I could afford, and we still actually own that house, and I built a studio out back there. But at that time, we were recording in the house.
Okay.
And so, we worked well together, and I just thought, the music that I'm loving, the music that I want to make in my head, like, I couldn't think of a more perfect artist for, like, that, like, what my next step needed to be felt like what her next step needed to be. So we kind of started in, and I toured with her a little bit on that first record. So that was really the first full-length record that I just thought, this needs to be, like, for me, it felt like a statement of what I wanted to do, what I could do. And I knew she wanted to go to the same place. So that was a record called The Waking Sleep. And Katie, like, I kind of fidget around with everything and play everything, and so does she. And she has that reputation. And so I knew, like, we were going to co-produce the record, but I was working with someone who played a lot of instruments. And so I wanted to make a very colorful record where all the pieces were kind of carved out and separated, and there was just kind of a lot going on. But I also wanted to make a very different kind of record. And Matthew Perryman Jones was a friend of mine for a long time as well. He used to open up for the band that I was in. And he had made a couple other records before we started working together, but he was someone that I just always really wanted to work with. I wanted to work with him earlier on, and I just wasn't ready. But I felt like I kind of knew what I was doing more, and he asked me to make a record with him, and I thought, this is the perfect record to be like completely opposite of Katie's, where like, he could sit and play a chord for 8 bars, and it could be interesting if it was recorded right. And so we made a record called Land of the Living, and that was where with Katie it was mainly, we had other people play on it for sure, but it was a lot of just me and her, fidgeting with different sounds. Where with Matthew's record, I barely played anything, and we tracked that in a barn in Texas. Like, we found this ranch in Texas. A friend of ours had a studio down there, but I wanted the sound of that record to be where everything was kind of glued together, and it felt like an organism kind of pumping behind his strong voice, So I wanted to make 2 really different sounding records, and then the third record was for K.S. Rhodes, who's another guy who can play everything, can arrange everything, but I felt like his record maybe felt like a blend of those 2. Yeah, there was a little earthier. There was a band performance element with strings and everything.
I was gonna ask if there were strings.
Yeah. So those were the 3 records. Like those are the years where I was like, working 18-hour days, just really, trying to just sort of, for my own self. I feel like when you're younger, like you want to know how far you can go. You want to know where your limits are, and I guess those were my limits.
Yeah. Those are some great records.
But that was important to do during a time where I had other income, and so eventually the transition was made into, okay, now I'm just doing this full time. Like I'm getting asked enough to do this, where it's a full time schedule, and you just can't have an open ended record where we'll be like, well, we're just gonna work 3 years in the cracks of everything else and just see it'll be done when it's done.
But you just had a record come out that was like that. Right? It was great.
What's that? Which one?
A 3-year record with Sanders?
Oh yeah, Sanders was kind of that way.
That was kind of on purpose.
No,
it's different.
Yeah, and I think I've always kind of, because sometimes if you're working with an artist on a label, they've got touring schedules, they've got release dates, there's people with expectations and timelines, and so you just can't be like, man, it's done when it's done. You know, like there's people are investing money, and there's like it feels a lot different. But I've always kind of had that ideal of like I always want to have that back burner record going on that you're just doing for its own sake, and Sandra's record kind of ended up being that way.
Which that's Sandra McCracken. And what was the name of the record that just came out?
Songs from the Valley.
Songs from the Valley. Yeah.
So,
I figure that must be subconsciously in there somewhere, the 3 years, because I just seen.
Oh, it was she said that, and that's kind of how it ended up. But it wasn't like
right. It wasn't what you're referencing.
Yeah. So anyway, that brings us up to whatever year.
Yeah, I don't know. So did you have your space behind your house in the middle of those projects, or was that all still inside the house?
No, that all ended up being in the space.
In the space.
So I ended up, again, never really feeling like I could just afford to go be in a big studio to make a record. Even though studio rates have been more affordable, I just knew I needed to be... So before I was set up in the house, had gotten married, we'd have friends over for dinner, and I was like, I just don't need to be pulling out mics and putting them away. I need to be set up and stay set up and have people walk into a place that feels like a dedicated space. And I took out a HELOC and built a cinder block building behind my house for $22,000.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, and paid it off in 4 years.
Oh, that's great.
But everyone would be like, you need to build a room within a room and have uneven walls, and it needs to be all this perfect stuff. And I just was like, if I can't hear the difference, I can't afford to spend money on it. I just need to get into a space and work, and it needs to be something I can afford. And I've been in enough situations with people that were really good and making good music that wasn't a perfect environment. Like that was my upbringing, was like working with Malcolm in his houses. It was just houses, and so... I worked out of that space for 8 years.
Yeah.
But had one little ISO booth, no windows. The ISO booth didn't have any windows.
Well, until that tree fell, then you kind of got
that's right.
Skylight.
The tree did fall through the roof once.
That time. Short aside, because I was, I guess I was either interning or assisting for Paul at the time, Paul Moak, and. Was that the flood? When did that happen?
Well,
or was it just a big storm that came through?
A tree fell over from the neighbor through the alley and hit another tree, which fell over.
That's right.
And crashed through the edge of the studio, through the vocal booth. And I just borrowed...
was it Andy's?
Yeah,
67?
His Neumann 67.
Yeah.
His 10 gram mic. He let me borrow it, and it was in that booth that the tree fell through. So I went out there, and I wrapped it up, and I brought it into the house, and that's the only thing I tried to save.
So we came over the next day, and I don't. Somebody was there with a chainsaw, and we were carrying things.
But this is one of my enduring memories of you.
Oh gosh.
And how kind you are, and how thoughtful you are of other people. He's there to help. And, people were tarping up, cut the tree down, we're tarping it up or taping it up. And you've got tape and all this stuff and hammer and all this stuff. And I was like, Dewey, thank you so much for helping. And I went like this to say, hand me some stuff, let me help you carry it. And you adjusted everything over to this one hand and then shook my hand.
That's so funny.
But I was trying to help you out.
That's great. I don't remember that at all.
You just wanted to shake my hand and say,
That's
you're welcome.
so funny. Yeah, you're welcome. Glad to help. I'm trying to remember, too, because there was one time, it might have been you were working on a Chelsea Scotch record that I had just bought on Craigslist, a pair of Cascade Fatheads or something. And, but you either needed, a couple of XLRs or a couple mics or something, and you, kicked me $20 for...
borrowing
it essentially, and I can't remember. It was either that or the time that Shane sent me to move stuff around in Charlie Peacock's attic. Okay. One of those 2 times was the first time that I made money in the music industry, and so I can't remember which happened first. So you're in good company of the, like, you know, whoever gave me some money to do something remotely associated with music first. So I'm still grateful for it. So you're making records out of that space, and then like, I know a lot of the names that we put on, like, the really abbreviated credit list, so that way people would want to show up, because they're like, we don't know this Cason Cooley man. Who's this Cason Cooley man? He's worked on this music that I know and love, but hasn't, like, made a big show about it. So you know, some of those names were Ingrid Michaelson. You've mentioned Katie Herzig and Trent Dabbs, and we've talked about Matthew Perryman Jones. So now you're in a different studio space, and I think Ben Rector is on there as well, which I don't remember what you did on that, but
I did about half his last record.
Okay, yeah. So walk us from, like, I feel like maybe we got to about 2014 or so.
Yeah,
we're getting close to current times now.
No, it is funny. Like, even when I think about styles of music and seasons of my life, there's, like, late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, late, like, every few years has a different sound in my head, right. Different things that I was into, and then there's, like, 2002, and then, like, everything else. Like, everything else is, like, in one big block in my head. It doesn't feel as divided out. And even with my career, it feels a little bit that way too. But
it's the children.
Yeah, it is the children. It's a lot of children.
I was talking with James Miller out there about that. How, like, we're talking about, like, the passage of time. It's just like, suddenly with children, it's just like, what? I think that was, like, 6 months ago, and it was, like, 3 years ago. Anyway.
No, yeah, and then I think, well, the next 10 years will feel like that way too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I made those records, and then that kind of, trickled into, like, I've never had a steady diet of label work or just indie stuff. It's all been all over the map, and even the past few years has been a little dizzying too, because I just feel like the expectation to make a record isn't there the way it used to be. Like, now I'll get approached by artists, but it's like, let's write and build a track, and then there's, like, a hope they want to use it amount of time, and if they do want to use it, it's not like, okay, now that we're formally doing this, let's start from scratch and go for it. It's like, you're building on what you've already done, because you're using the same tools and you're writing in the same space, but you're not really helping them think of a bigger picture. You're just trying to build a track that works. You know, like, so that feels a little different now. But I guess why I said that is also that gets you into, like, doing a couple songs for this artist, a couple songs for that artist. These couple are going to be on a label, maybe. This is just for film and TV placement. So it gets a little bit more. It's harder to track my career arc, because up until, like, the time that we're talking about, I'm doing full-length records for people almost exclusively. So this year I did these records, and then that kind of led to these things. So, but after I'd done those 3, I was starting to get calls from, I don't know, just maybe more established artists. But yeah, on the list you mentioned Ingrid Michaelson. So Katie Herzig was with, still is with a Secret Road placement company, and then Secret Road's owned by Lynn Grossman, who manages Ingrid Michaelson. Okay. So I kind of knew those people and was kind of in that realm. And Ingrid was a fan of the record that I did with Katie. Okay. So I think the original request was that she wanted Katie to produce with her. Yeah. And then so I felt pulled into that from, Katie being, well, I kind of did all this with Cason, and, let's all work together. So Ingrid came and we all wrote together, and we ended up doing, it's always been about, like, half of her records. Like, I never done the full thing. Sure. But we had done a handful of songs for a record of hers, and we were done, and they kind of floated that song "Girls Chase Boys" over that. They're like, hey, we got this song we wrote, we think it could be cool, can you guys take a day kind of work on it. We had just started digging in pretty heavily with Katie's records, so it was kind of like, well, we're kind of back in this headspace, but let's just take a day and see what happens. So we just spent a day on a demo, sent it off, and then didn't hear anything for a while. And then, however long later, they're like, hey, we really love this. We think we want it to be the first single. We thought they might even put on the record.
Right.
We think it's going to be the single. Do you want to do anything else to it? And her band was in town, so we had them play on it a little bit. I mean, we didn't spend a ton of time on it. It just, like I said, it's like it wasn't that formal thing. It was just like, it was kind of softballed over.
Right.
Try this out, finish it up, and then, and then it was like, I mean, it was crazy because that has been the most successful song that I've worked on in terms of just charting and sales and everything. But I remember having it on my laptop, thinking I might get a call from them any day because we were still kind of working on it. I might get a call any day to send it off to mix,
Yeah.
So I took it home for Christmas and had it on my laptop in my parents' basement in Wichita, in the same room with my dad's little 8-track recorder where I grew up. And the call came through. It was like, hey, can you they got Serban to mix that one song. And they're like, he can mix it on this day. Can you send it to him? And I was like, well, fortunately, I brought my laptop in case I needed to mix prep it real quick. So I sat in my parents' basement and mix prepped it and sent it off. And that ended up being what the song was. So it felt I was like...
That's like so full circle.
Yeah, I was like, I'm sitting here in my parents' basement, like uploading this song to Serban. It felt kind of surreal.
Should have sent it to him on the 8 track.
Yeah.
This is how we did this. We did this, but with this.
But then that opened up, more doors to work with other artists that I guess that was like what felt different in my career too was after that and a little before that where I was getting calls to produce records for people I'd never met. Because before it was always like friends of a friend, people I knew, and that I feel like I co-produce a lot because people feel comfortable with me. Right. Hey, I know that guy. I can be in a room with him and feel comfortable, and we can make art together. You did my friend's record; they told me all about it, and that kind of moved to just people I'd never met before, calling you, and then and the tone's different. Like they approach you with a different tone, and because you don't have a track record with each other. So, I was doing that for a while, and now, like I said, it's all kind of splintered out into a bunch of random things, but So maybe that brings us up.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well up to present day. Like you have some projects that are in the hopper for this year. Any of those you want to mention or can mention or?
Yeah. Well, Katie Herzig, we finished a record. It's been a little over a year ago now, mastered and done. But she's been kind of just trickling it out. That's another big change. It's like just not dropping a whole record at once, but just like doing singles over the course of months and then dropping the whole thing later. So she's released 5 of those songs. She released one last week. And then I think the whole record's coming out on March 2nd. So and that'd be like the 3rd full length I've done with her. Cool. And then Ingrid, who I've worked on her past 2 records, she's been off. She was on a show on Broadway for a while. Right. She's been developing a show for Hulu. She's been acting in some movies, and I remember thinking like she may never want to come back and do a record. Like she just feels artistically in a different space. Like maybe she just doesn't want to write songs for herself and perform them, in the traditional artist way. And I was right because she called Katie and I. She's like, "Can we have a conference call? Like I want to talk about this project idea." And she's like, and she said it basically verbatim that like I don't think I want to make another record right now. But I've been so inspired by this show, Stranger Things. And she's like, and I basically want to, like, I'm writing, like watching the show and being inspired and writing songs about it. So I want to make this whole record where basically we just watch Stranger Things and write songs and like do it. So I'm like, that's like the dream gig because you get to do something really fun, but you don't have to be that guarded about the artist's identity. Right. Like you get to, because I mean, how many times, you're in the studio working with an artist and they're, everyone wants to break new ground and change, but there's that sense of like, we're all listening to this music and you do something that's inspired by that and you all like it, but you go, but it doesn't really fit well in this artist. It feels forced and doesn't, it's not right for them. So with this project, I feel like we can be a little bit more let's do whatever we want. You know?
Yeah, it's for characters.
Yeah,
that's great.
So it's a fun kind of project to do. So we spent a week writing. Week before last, we're doing it another week in April. So we're going to try to release it when season 3 comes out, which isn't going to be till 2019. So
you got some time.
It might be a bit of a backlog.
Okay. A little slow burn Ingrid record. Very cool. Awesome. Well, I think.
So that's the story.
That's the whole story. There it is. Cason Cooley. You all know him now. Here we are. Well, I'm sure all of these lovely people in here have had a chance to think of questions, but we will stop now for a moment so that you can all refresh your beverages.
Music City Listeners is brought to you by 4115, the East Nashville recording studio dedicated to serving up homestyle recordings since 2012. And Music City Content Kings, a creative photo and video production company that believes in transparency and value. Good to Go, serving up the goodness from our favorite food truck and catering events for people who have good taste. And Handmade Productions, a couple of wildly talented dudes making all things music and video.
Questions?
Anybody got any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So as you were starting your progress from just kind of being an accessory utility player into being a producer and projects were coming in, did it feel like there was always a natural next step, or were there some times when you would finish a project and not be sure if there was another one that was coming in, and kind of how did you navigate those waters?
Yeah, I mean that's still the case. But I've someone mentioned Trent Dabbs earlier. His wife manages me now, so it kind of helps fill my calendar a little bit. But that's pretty recent. Like it hasn't even been 2 years. So yeah, there would be times where, with full length records happening, like I would block out a month or 2 or 3 for a record, and I might know what I was doing 8 or 9 months into the future, and then I'd be like, something eventually will happen. Then you get to the end of that time, and there would be nothing there, So that happens a lot still.
Yeah. So how do you convince yourself that it's worth waiting for the next thing to come and not just feel like, well, I guess this is as much as I can do, and I guess we'll go.
Fortunately, it's never been too long.
Yeah.
Like something would happen eventually. And I guess during some of that time too, like I would do session work. Like I was saying, I don't have a record or an instrument that I play particularly well, but I would do session work, play piano for people, play keys on other records, and like there was definitely a season of time where, every couple months I would get a call from a producer, like we're tracking a record, and they would just hire you for a whole week, like Monday through Friday. This is the day rate. Can you be here? And I'd show up with all my keyboards, and we would sit and track a record. So that used to happen. So that would help fill that time too. If things were kind of slow. And then I had I played bass. There's an artist named Andrew Peterson that I produced a record for, and I played on the road with him for a while. But he still does a Christmas tour, and I play that Christmas tour, 2.5 to 3 weeks in December every year. I didn't do the last 4 years. That was sort of like the last holdout of my touring. But so there would always be enough things peppered into that, that I don't know. You just string a year together somehow. But does that kind of answer the question, or like if there was
like the work breeds more work?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess the thing is, like, you do it. I've been doing it 20 years now, and then my parents did it. So I think the flow of it, the rhythm of it, was comfortable for me. The not having any job security part of it felt normal to me because of the upbringing I had. Like I never had anyone in my life that was like, "This is fun, but one day you're gonna have to get a real job." So I guess maybe I had the emotional temperament for a slow season. I still can have slow seasons, and so. I was going to say this earlier too. If anyone relates to this, or this is helpful to anyone, like I would do session work, and I never really loved doing that because I feel like there's sort of this ideal or premium put on like things happening live in the moment, like that's real music, and there's an authenticity to that. And I never totally related to that because I guess maybe like I have a bit of anxiety about that, like being in the hot seat, having to come up with a part in the moment, execute it in the moment, record quality, just like showing up and like being amazing. Like that always kind of stressed me out a little bit. So I always wanted to kind of retreat into my own corner and come up with something, like develop a part, develop a sound, and have it. So I think getting out of session work and producing more made sense to me. Because even when I was producing records, when I first started, there was a lot of just tracking live. Like you get a band of people together and you track live. And I thought that was amazing, but I always kind of...
That was my phone.
I was always the guy I couldn't wait to take it home and kind of monkey around with it on my own time. So even with... so I feel like the transition from being a studio musician to in record production was good because I got a little bit more time on my own to kind of mess with stuff. Yes.
It's kind of a two-parter.
All right.
The parts aren't related, but the first one doesn't really count. So you mentioned when you were 16 or 17, listening to a record, and that was the moment, like, oh, I want to be a part of these decisions. Do you remember what record that was?
I do. Yeah, it's a funny one. It was Michael W. Smith's "I'll Lead You Home" record.
Yes.
And I remember, like, yeah, I kind of grew up on the road doing, gospel music with my parents. I remember hearing, this doesn't totally relate to your question, but a little bit of like what I was listening to during that time, or how I kind of, my musical understanding broadened. Like, I remember hearing like "Pour Some Sugar on Me" by Def Leppard and thinking that was like incredible. And I was hearing Michael Jackson and all this other music, and then I really wanted my parents to buy me like Petra and Carmen, like these sort of contemporary Christian music cassettes. And they didn't really want me listening to Christian rock because they thought if I did, I would start listening to like secular rock. And they were totally right. And it changed my life. It was amazing.
Second part was, have you ever felt throughout the course of learning and developing like your producing year and things like that, have you ever had an interaction or maybe a session or a meeting or anything where anything that stands out where afterwards you said to yourself, man, I blew it. My career's over. That I blew it and it could not have gone any worse. They're never gonna call me back. Does anything stand out in your mind? And if so, like, what'd you do about it?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I've missed a lot of notes live. Nothing that ever train wrecked anything. In terms of like a recording that just like really tanked or didn't hit the mark.
Or at least in your mind you thought it did. But
well, I always think, I feel like it's funny that like getting close to 15 years of producing now, still starting off a project, there's that sense of like, this is going to be the one that I totally fail at, and I'll be exposed for the fraud that I am, and everyone will know that I don't know what I'm doing. Like that still is in the room.
Oh wow.
I don't think that ever really goes away, and I guess it shouldn't. But I don't know that anything's been like, well, it's such a failure that it caused problems. I mean, I listen back to some stuff now. I'm like, ooh, that was a decision we made. But I know it's happened. I know that feeling. I definitely know that feeling of like, oh, this is not going well.
Like, I can't believe I just said that.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, someone else may have a good story about me if you ask them. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about like the time in your career where it went from making records with people that you knew to make people that you didn't know at all come to do stuff. And kind of that in-between period, how'd you go about finding work or finding people that would let you make the records?
I don't know. I guess it's always kind of come to me. Like I'm not a. I mean, I'll hustle if I need to hustle, but I'm not real forward about calling people up and being like, "Do you think you're awesome? You should come over and do something." And I kind of made that point earlier, but I think I've been fortunate enough that people have called me. Yeah. So I've never really been good about going out and drumming up my own work. But if I do need to do that, I think I do like what I was saying. Just try to. I mean, I don't ask people to work with people that I wouldn't want to work with. So if I'm asking someone or saying I want to work with them, like I'm sincere about it, so I feel comfortable doing it. And yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. Yes.
I'm just wondering, like, when you're starting a new jam, do you find yourself pining over the approach or the sounds that you're going to be taking, or do you find value in being impulsive and tracking numerous ideas and editing down later and pulling out, trimming the fat in that way?
I mean, both for sure. I mean, in an ideal situation, I'll sit with an artist and make like a Spotify playlist, an interactive playlist. I think that's pretty normal for people to do now. When I first started doing it, I thought it was real brilliant. But I'd call it, like a musical Pinterest board of wanting to have a good, clean jumping off point of what we wanted to do. But I always held that as like a jumping off point, and knowing that things were going to take their own shape eventually, and people would have different ideas, and we'd go in different directions. But I want to be prepared. So I do like having kind of a clear vision most of the time, just to be abandoned. But when I started making records too, I was working with different artists. I'd always try to have a different approach. I think maybe if I was like a better business person, I would have like this is the type of record I make. This is the sound I do. This is my method. And I could get really, really good at this one thing. And then people would know that if you need that thing, you can go to this guy and it's worth the money and he can do that thing. But I've never really built myself that way. I think just my personality type's too curious. I mean, or just sporadic or something, where I like doing all these different types of records. That also gets into a lot of different processes. But if I did have like a certain way where I feel like it ended up coming into a certain format, is I would take an artist and say, and this is like when I'm not writing with them, they bring me their songs and say, there's going to be a 3-week period where we just go for whatever. We experiment, we make noises, we try to find cool sounds. Like let's start way out here and see if we can work it back into the middle and find some really unique ways to approach a song, and then set it aside. And I'll go work on another record for a minute, and you go back wherever the artist is from, and then we'll reconvene in a couple months and we'll listen to the mess we made and figure out how to make a record out of it. And I think that was always sort of a more interesting way to make a record for me. And that's why I prefer to do bigger projects, because you get to do that, and you get to find these common threads and a cohesion to the songs, and so a little bit of both is the short answer. Yeah.
So as a producer, do you, this is more of a businessy question, but as far as what you, like, say you charge per song or per project, do you base that off of, like, if the person, like, if say you're having to write a ton with an artist, like they're coming to you with not as developed songs, does that to you mean that, maybe you don't think of it consciously this way, but is that basically implying that it's going to cost a little more? Or for you, is it just kind of like this is the cost and I'm willing to do whatever I need to, writing, creative, but all the stuff that a producer would do plus writing, and that's just, I'm willing to give you everything I got for this? Or is it kind of like you feel like as a producer you should have to be able to charge a little bit more or whatever if somebody's relying on you to help them write, like, and really finish their songs? Like
if you're being invited into the writing process, hopefully that time will be compensated in the publishing. So you're you're standing to make more money on the record because you have a cut of the publishing, because you invested that time. So as much as I can, try to see those as different things, because it's a different ask. Like being asked to write can be different than it being asked to produce, even though now that process is pretty intertwined a lot of times. But yeah, I guess you just kind of got to balance that out a little bit with, whether how much you think that project might have legs, there's a whole other thing of considerations there. But yeah, I feel like I wouldn't, if someone came to me and was like, hey, I've got these 10 songs, I want you to produce them, I might have a rate for that. If another artist came and was like, I got these 10 songs, but they're all half done, I want you to kind of help me finish writing them, I wouldn't charge them more money for that, because I would be more invested. I would potentially make more money on it because of that. So I've never charged for writing, my time for writing. I think some people do. Some talking about, like, bigger writers might say, it's just a flat rate for this day. But you got to be pretty heavy swinger, I think, to do that.
I got another question for you. You spoke earlier of producing as a period of emotional babysitting. As you developed as a producer, have there been any resources that have been helpful in getting better at that, or has it just been kind of an intuitive learning process for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been intuitive. I used to joke that, like, I said there was never a course to take it. You can't go to school and just study record production. But if you could, I think you would study arranging and psychology. Because whether you're doing modern music or classical music or whatever, like, you got to think about how the different frequencies fit together, and point, counterpoint, all that stuff still applies, and no matter how avant-garde you're getting, So arranging, but then the psychology side of it too. It's like keeping people in a headspace where they feel good about themselves in a way that's not blowing smoke. Like, I think people know when they're being BS'd, and people know when you're sincerely complimenting them. And I don't think I'm great at it. I see other producers that I think are really good about, a compliment sandwich. You've heard that term of, like, hey, you're great at this, change this a little bit, but you're doing great. I'm not, I feel for years I was like, I don't want to, like, people can see through that, so I'm just going to say, like, hey, can you do it a little bit more like this? Thanks. And I've kind of learned that, like, that can really send people up into their head. Like, you really do have to be like, hey, you are sounding great, and I do need you to do this, but we're okay here, like just being able to kind of, I think I've gotten better at it, but I don't think I'm as good as I've seen people be a lot better at it than I am. Yeah, I can be a little too even-keeled sometimes. Yes.
When you have worked with people for a while, like Katie or somebody like that, does it get more difficult to produce certain things and keep them in that headspace since you know each other so well? Or is it?
Yes and no.
Easier?
Yeah. Yeah, it's in that Tom Petty documentary with where Jimmy Iovine's like, after 3 records you should shoot your producer, because I do feel like you kind of, you should get into new creative space, and you can't get too comfortable with someone. But there is also that thing too of, like, you can be more free to just do dumb things, because you're like, this person knows that I can, that I'm okay at what I do. Like I don't have to prove myself every second of every day, and I can fail at things and not worry about them firing me or them thinking that they've made a huge mistake. So it can provide those kind of freedoms, and you can just sort of be like, hey, you're doing the thing you do. Like you don't do that. They think you're not hammering on them or something. So yeah, there's a comfortability there for sure. Yes.
I wanted to piggyback on kind of the businessy question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Razor, so I'm assuming, like, you do sync stuff sometimes, and there'll be, like, singles that you do for sync that never see the light of day, but will work for sync or something, I don't know. So when you're doing those kinds of writes where you're also a co-writer, but you're the dude, you're making the track, how do you account for the time that you're putting into the track, it's like, okay, well, yeah, I'm getting a cut of the pub and the master, but I just spent 3 days on this track, and while I was doing that, you, the other writer, had 4 other co-writes.
Right.
You know, so how do you navigate that?
Well, I mean, yeah, because if something gets a sync or picked up by something, there's always the publishing side, but then there's also the master side, like who owns the recording, and that's sort of another pool of money. So in that situation, if someone's every scenario would be a little bit different.
Yeah.
Say it was a 3-way co-write, where it's
Yeah.
me, an artist, and then a writer. Well, that writer may or may not get a cut of that master side because their identity isn't going on the track. They're not the artist, and they're not also sitting around putting in the groundwork of building the track. So that might be a scenario. If it's a scenario where I'm doing that with an artist that's signed to a label, and they want to put the label wants to put it out, then they'll come pay me my fee for it.
Gotcha.
You know, so I'll get compensated for that time later.
Yeah.
So usually I'm going to get compensated for it later, or I'm doing a greater risk, greater reward scenario where if it does get picked up by something, I'm going to split the master with that artist, and that would be arguably more than my rate would have been, you know. But I also may not make anything on it, and you know, a lot of things don't. Yeah. Every situation, I think I've spent years trying to be like, what's the rule here? Like, I need to know what this is, so we go in the door and we know exactly what this is going to be. And every artist is different. Every artist is in a different situation. Every artist is bringing a different set of tools to the table.
Yeah.
Some do a lot of work on the track. Some don't do any. And it is a little bit. You can feel a little shafted sometimes when you're like, you're the only person doing any work on the track. You do spend a few days on it, and something happens, and then it's getting split by a bunch of people, and you're kind of like, well, everyone spent, you all put in 4 hours, but I just put in 4 days, you know. So that happens sometimes too, but you just got to have a positive attitude.
I was thinking that might be the answer, like, it just happens.
It's it's you know, sometimes you eat the bear, sometimes the bear eats you. The whole thing's a give and take thing, you know. And sometimes you come out ahead, sometimes you don't. Yes.
I have a question from a different angle. You mentioned the moments, like the times when you're in between work and there's lulls.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how that affects your marriage, and is there, like, what's your wife's take on it? Is there support, or is she like?
No, she's really supportive. That was remember what I was saying earlier about, like, when I first got married, I was like, I'm going to treat this like a real job. Like, my wife's been great about respecting it as a real job. Like, if I'm needing to put in hours, then I put in hours. You know, like this is, if this is going to work for our family, this has to work if it's going to work for our family, you know. And this a little bit answers your questions too, but even with our kids, like, we try to teach them like work is a gift. Like, it's a gift to have work. Like, work isn't the enemy of the family, and it's something we should be thankful for and do with diligence. And so she knew she was marrying a musician, that there would be ups and downs of that. So nothing's really thrown her off, and there's never been like big lulls. But for the first, there was years there where I was working on those records, trying to kind of build up my portfolio, hoping that it would lead to more work later, where I could get busier with this. And we were having kids, and she worked at Vanderbilt before we met. Like, I bought that house in West Eastland. I had roommates. Their rent covered most of the mortgage, so I didn't have a big overhead. I intentionally had a small overhead. And then we got married, and all of a sudden there's like 2 incomes, and you know, the bills are being kind of split. And then, you know, we have kids, and then she quits her job to stay home, and then all of a sudden, like, all the bills are just on me. But I'm not really to that point yet as a producer, but I'm trying to get these records done, and it felt like the candle was burning down on both ends, and we made it out of that time. You know, like I feel like we were able to kind of to get ahead and make it work. But even as I was growing, our bills were getting bigger, so things were tight. But now our kids are in school, and she's been able to work again. And when she started working again, it was like I hadn't even considered that we could have a second income, you know. So just having a second income like really took a lot of that stress off, you know. So we have, I don't know, there's definitely like income is never steady, but it's never caused a lot of problems in our marriage.
You're lucky.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We have a sort of strict timeline with a label or whatnot. You have to produce an album. What sort of things do you do to stay on track? Do you like set goals and divide your time, like keep this area for experimentation and then start laying beds here? Like, what's your approach to that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not that methodical, I guess. So nothing that specific, but I mean, maybe like you have a tracking session, you're gonna have an overdub session. You have a little, like one. If I'm working, I'm thinking of a couple scenarios, but if working with an artist where we kind of know what it needs to sound like in general. You know, like we're gonna try to find some creativity within certain parameters, but maybe we'll do the tracking session, make sure the songs are written and arranged well, do the tracking session, and then bring it back to my studio, and that's where we'll kind of do the experimentation of like kind of messing with the arrangements a little bit, adding different textures here and there, and then do the vocals and be done. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Like it just happens a little faster, I guess. Like I won't. It's hard for me to kind of land on something sometimes because I can kind of keep experimenting. But in those situations, you're just kind of like, you're trusting your instincts, but you're also trusting the team of people working with you too. Like if they're like, this sounds really good to us, this is what we're looking for, you just might agree to that a little quicker than normal. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about like the role in songwriting and production is like, you know, is that something you typically do on most of the projects that you're doing, or is it just
it's become that because like again, like I got into this because I loved records. I wanted there to be records. I like listening to records, but I've never been a songwriter in terms of like, even my parents wrote songs. I've just never written songs like on my own. Like it's never been my expression of how to express myself, you know. But I've enjoyed songwriting with other people because it's very similar to producing. Like it's like I'm being a character actor in their world. Like what would they say? What would be good for them to say? What would they want to do? So I feel like when I'm in a songwriting situation, I feel like I'm producing them writing their song, if that makes sense, yeah. You know. So I'm not like some producers or writers, they get into production. I'm kind of a producer that got into writing. And I'll tell people, I'm up front, like sometimes I have good title ideas. Sometimes, you know, like I'll probably be good for a few good lines throughout the day, but I'm like usually not the heavy hitter with any one aspect of the writing. But I think I'm a good editor. I think I have a good perspective on the whole thing. I think I'm good at recognizing when something works, and like I'm good at tweaking things. So like I feel like if there's good writers in the room, I can kind of keep it moving in a good direction and kind of filter it in. But I'm not like, I don't sit at home and write songs. Yes.
You mentioned like two styles of production where you're like, oh, on Matt's record we're gonna do like you know, like this living organism behind the voice, mm-hmm. And then like Katie's stuff, you're sort of piecing stuff. You said you're piecing things together. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you can elaborate on that, and in particular how it relates to the Ingrid tune. You know, you sort of like, oh, her band's in town, so let's go track her band, and then like,
yeah,
you know, how many, you know, kind of what calls did you make before the band came in as opposed to after? Was the track sort of already together and it was just like we just did then, or do you do a lot of your stuff in post?
The track was together on that one, and that's, I was going to say this earlier too, like how I've changed in record making and how I see it has changed a lot. I'm going to take two steps back and really give you a long answer. Yeah. But when the band that I was in broke up, I went back to Wichita for a little while. Remind me of your question in a minute because I may forget it. But I came back to town, and a lot of my friends had become session players and were getting really good gigs, and they kind of felt like they were starting to be established, and I felt like I was really behind. Like I wasn't established. So when I started producing, they were the resources I had. It was like my friends that were good session players. And they were all young enough where everyone was like it was affordable to get people together in a studio for several days. So everything I produced started like that. Artist comes in, they play the song for the band, we chart it out, we talk about a direction, everyone plays it, and then eventually I take that back and do more work in post. And I feel like that first day, that worked well because an artist hears their song performed with the band for the first time. They've been playing it by themselves. Everyone's excited. The band figured out a cool take on it. Everyone's fist pumping and high-fiving. Everyone's in a good mood. And then a lot of times I listen to it a few days later, removed from that experience, and be like, well, it sounds like a guy playing. It sounds a little typical, like not as interesting. And when I first started working with Katie Herzig, who co-produced the Ingrid stuff with me, like she was kind of monkeying around with stuff on her own, and it wasn't on a grid, and it wasn't properly recorded, but it had character and it had imagination, it had spark, and that was sort of like where I first got into this idea of building a song around a spark, like something that wasn't just like people playing live in a room. And so I think I kind of abandoned what I thought the rules were and tried to find something really interesting that someone was doing, and then kind of build a world around that, and if it didn't fit quite right, then maybe that would still be a virtue to what it was. So in the case of the Ingrid song, that was, I've done 2 songs with her, both with Katie, that have done well for her, that were singles. That was the first one, and the way that happened was like Katie and I had done the demo all with programming, and then I was still a little bit in that headspace of like, we needed, for this to be a real thing, we need to have players come play on it. So I'd hired some friends of mine to play on it, and then that's when they were like, hey, her band's actually going to be in town, let's just have her band do it. So we kind of canceled on the players, and her band came in and played. I'd never worked with them before, and they were great, and I've worked with some of them since, and they're fantastic players. And it worked really well for that song, but it gave that song a little bit more of a grittiness to it, an earthiness of it. The drums were, and Ingrid made a great call on that song too. We had the drums on, and everything sounded really good. And she was like, I just listened to this Imagine Dragons track, and the drums are real distorted sounding. Well, I just listened to like a Pensado's place the day before with Alex the Kid, who had talked about how he gets those sounds, like just crushes the 2-bus through an L1, and was kind of how he's getting that sound. So I was like, hey, I know how to do that, so we slammed it through this limiter, and it busted it up, and so it kind of gave the track this gritty character to it. And I didn't know that they were going to give it to Serban to mix. I would think of him as like top 40 radio, where things are kind of more programmed out and designed and crafted a little bit more, and not just sort of like people playing live in a room. He did a great job on the mix. It sounds incredible. The song did very well. But I remember thinking, like, if I would have known it was going to go to him, I would have liked to have maybe built the track a little differently, with more programming and less live instruments. But it turned out great. But they came back a couple years later and asked Katie and I to produce another single called Hell No. And we knew we would end up there, so we were able to kind of build it a little bit more, maybe more modern sounding or something. So, well, that track has no live instruments; it's all programmed. So, who's to say which is better? But that was, in terms of how I build a track or what I'm looking for, it can be a little bit different. But I used to think very much like it needs to be live instruments, and now it's almost like can be an afterthought, unless it's a very specific type of record like Matthews, where it needs to be built live. I love tracking live. I don't work with a lot of artists that are coming and asking for that, but we talked about John Tibbs earlier. Like, I'm doing some stuff with him, and we're talking about tracking it, trying maybe getting out of town and letting like the core of what the sound of that needs to be live people playing in a room. I haven't done that in a long time, and yeah, I think I'm gonna have an opportunity to do it. I'm actually really looking forward to it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and then it's just a matter of like, how much are you doing much with the live band after the fact? Because I feel like the Ingrid stuff has a great combination of like, oh, it's real people playing, but then there's this element of it being a little chopped. Maybe it's a little chopped up here and there, and maybe it's a little like gridded out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like.
I mean, how much are you preserving like the original performances, you know?
Yeah. Well, yeah, if I'm doing drums after I've kind of built the track, which usually happens that way, I don't want everything to be on the grid. I want everything to have feel. But when you built it on programming, and then you put the live drums on and that has feel, it's like you've got to either like retrofit your programming to match the drums or vice versa. And I guess a lot of times I will really lock the verses in tight, and then in terms of like, you know, I'll do a drum comp. Like if the drummer does 10 passes, like I'll comp it together, you know, into the performance that I like, and then we'll you know, beat detective the verses to be super tight, and a lot of times the choruses too. But I'll usually always try to leave drum fills not on the grid, so I feel like a lot of times drums they just do this with the programming where it becomes one sound, and maybe the listener doesn't really know if it's real or fake. But then when it goes for a fill, that feels real, you know. So you just have these moments of life that kind of things get a little bit outside of the grid, and then I feel like 9 times out of 10 I won't beat detective drums on the bridge, because I feel like that's kind of where the last chorus, like where the lid needs to come off a little bit, and then if there's some flamminess in it, that just kind of gives it a little bit extra life, hopefully. But so I do kind of like where you can't tell, or you can only tell in certain moments, you know, that maybe something's really happening there. Anybody else?
I have one last question I was just kind of thinking of. Are there any records that are kind of your go-to references when you're producing? Kind of like you look at them and think, well, if I could produce a record like that.
Oh, all the time. I think that, yeah, absolutely. You'd ask earlier, like if I had any big failures. Like everything's a big failure, right?
Until it's not.
No, I heard this quote the other day. It said like, all success is being able to move from one failure to the next one with a good attitude. You know, that's like anyone who's successful is just, you know, experiencing one failure after another. But yes, I listen to music all the time. I think there was a season in my life where I thought, I don't want to listen to stuff, I want to have original ideas. And then one day I just owned it. Like, I love listening to music. You're always a product of your influences, but I listen to things that inspire me, that I think sound great, and I aspire to it, and never hit the mark. It never sounds quite like what you intended to. But, I mean, yeah, I have a whole one Spotify playlist that's just speaker test, like it's called Speaker Test, and it's just things that I think sound incredible, that I will, if I'm in a foreign room, you know, I'll just listen to. And so, yeah, I definitely have these ideals in my head of what a good production is, or what a good song is, and I'm just constantly failing at getting to it.
And that's what makes you sound like you, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, like it's you, and and that's why I like working with the group too. Is like they come in with ideals, and you know, I mean, you can get excited. You can like what you do. I like the records I've done, but yeah, you definitely have things in your head that you're working towards. And you're like, it's not quite like that. But, yeah.
Well, that's such a great way to leave it right there. So, does anybody else have a burning question they have to get in before?
I just had one that was picking up his, but he's got.
I was just gonna ask what the last record you listened to that you loved so much you had to listen to over and over and over.
Oh, I get hooked on records like that. The last one I really got hooked on was Violence. You heard of that record? Like I kind of had to track that guy down, but he lives here.
Yeah, nice.
And like I hung out with him one day. This guy named Jeremy Larson, and he does this project called Violence, Violents, and yeah, I don't know. It's what's the name that Awake and Pretty Much Sober is the name of the record, and I don't know. It's just
Monica from Fox.
Yeah, it kind of feels like I was, like I'm a huge Sixpence None the Richer fan, and I played keys with them for a few years, and like that music is very much in me, and it feels kind of like if Sixpence was a little more programmed and had a different singer, it was like less acoustic, like it kind of has those sort of sweeping melodies. Like every melody just feels like really intentional. It doesn't feel like it came out of a write. It feels like someone sat and sculpted it over a long period of time, and the production has that feel too. So, yeah, I got stuck on that record for a while. The last Phanogram record, like I think sounds incredible. Like I just get bowled over by it. It's so programmed, but the drums feel like they're being played live, but who knows how they did that. And then there's like electric guitars in there, and I'm like, for them to fit that into kind of a modern vibe like that, I think is really incredible. I'm trying to think of anything else. Those are the two that come to mind.
Oh yeah, so I was just gonna piggyback off of his question. You mentioned the Spotify playlist, and I was just wondering what's on the playlist. What that like your speaker test? This is a song that I know by heart. I know how the room sounds because of this one song. I know what to do now. I mean, I'm just curious because we all have that record or that song. I was just curious what.
Well, it's a bunch of songs. One record that I always think sounds incredible is the Santa Gold record. Masters of My Make Believe, is that the name of it? Like just like the mixes on that record are just incredible. Magnet, have you guys ever heard of Magnet? This guy out of Finland.
He's great.
He's incredible. Like he mixes a lot of the stuff himself. The Santa Gold, Masters of My Make Believe, that song Riot's Gone is on there, and The Keepers. Amy Mann from the Magnolia soundtrack, Howling at the Moon, Phanogram, Step, Vampire Weekend, Horchata, Vampire Weekend, Wolfgang Amadeus Phoenix, that whole record. A lot of John Bryan stuff, Across the Universe by Fiona Apple. Love Lockdown, Kanye West. Between Me and You, Brandon Flowers.
Yes.
And then a bunch of stuff I did. That I was happy with, that I knew what it was supposed to sound like. The First Lord record, I think sounds incredible. Lana Del Rey, her first record. Roar by Katy Perry, it's pretty incredible. I don't know. Ghost Stories, Coldplay. That record sounded amazing to me.
Is that a public playlist?
I should post it, shouldn't I? Paper Tire by Beck. I think everyone has Paper Tire by Beck on their speaker playlist. That Vampire Weekend record, Contra. That was like a big, like even. Like the guy that mixed that, we tracked him down to mix Katie Herzig's stuff. His name's Justin Garish, and like, because we were making that record, and then I heard Contra, and I was like, that's it. Like that's sort of the strings and the programming and the quirky writing, like kind of all that coming together in one package. I'd never really heard it come together. It kind of felt like, oh, that's what I've kind of been hearing, but wasn't able to do. Like I failed to make that record a few times.
Well, Cason, thanks so much for coming tonight and sharing stories.
Thanks for spending some time with us here on YouTube. If you'd like to take us with you, search for Music City Listeners on your favorite podcasting platform.